So does some of this apply to the Oxford healthcare case?
Well, that's a good one. That's kind of an older one at this point, but that actually is sort of
pretty well known.
It's pretty well known, and that's actually kind of a good cautionary tale because it's not what we consider traditional security. Oxford Health Plans was a very big health plan, and health plans are data driven. These are the giant insurance companies, so they've got data on millions of people, on hundreds of millions of claims. They've got information about payments going to hundreds of healthcare providers and lots and lots of analysis that needs to happen to that to make sure that the right amounts are being paid to the right people at the right time for the right purposes. If you lose control of that, you're doomed. This is the mission of a health insurance organization. They decided to upgrade their systems, which is a fine idea. You should do that. But the problem was that in the process, they lost control. They lost control to such an extent that they were unable to accurately account for the transactions that they were engaged in. And they were basically saying to providers, okay, look, tell you what, we don't know what we owe you, so we're going to pay you this much right now, and then we'll reconcile it later on.
Sounds like a great way to run a bank.
Yeah. Unfortunately, also, the company wasn't exactly forthcoming in, it's a public company, was a public company, and so had to report in SEC filings risk factors. And losing control of your financial systems is a pretty major risk. And they sort of downplayed that. The bottom line is that they were sued by shareholder groups. They were come down on by regulatory agencies. They were investigated. It was very painful. There were class action. People lost jobs. Their outside auditors were sued as well. Individual executives were sued for breach of fiduciary duty. And we don't typically, when you and I are talking security, we're usually talking about, ooh, did you hear about the latest exploit that has come from somewhere interesting, and what do we know about it, and what could it do? But this is, absolutely a security problem that was caused by a legitimate mission-critical activity where they lost control. And, should security officers be involved in upgrades? Yes, because that's where gaps and problems open up. I don't know that a security officer could have done anything about Oxford's problems. That sounds more like it was a problem with your IT folks and your developers and the folks who were implementing it. But you need to be at the table for that, or your organization loses control.
It's one of those. Do you remember the nursery rhyme? For want of a nail, a shoe is lost. For want of a shoe, a horse is lost. For want of a horse, a king is lost. For want of a king, a kingdom is lost, all for the want of a horseshoe nail. And so I think that's where we are. And I think that perhaps you agree that boards and people in senior management positions may not even understand how vulnerable they are to something that small or that insignificant. You think an IT upgrade is commonplace, don't have to worry about it?
Yep, I think that's true. I think that before going through major projects like that, you obviously need to understand your risks, and they probably thought that they did, which leads you to the other side of it, which is that you can guarantee bad things will happen. So what's the plan when the bad thing does happen?
So John, this all sounds pretty daunting. The question becomes, what do we do?
Well, a few things. Number one, you need to try to get the board and the C-suite, the chief financial, chief executive, et cetera, officers, to understand and take seriously security concerns, which means, for one thing, address and quash the small ones so that they don't have to hear about every little thing, unless they happen to want to, but make sure that they know that when you're bringing them an issue, it's a real issue. Another one is I recommend against doing what I would call kind of minimalist risk management and risk assessment. There are sort of choices you can make. How much do we spend on risk assessment. How much do we spend on risk management? We can lowball it and go for the least. We check the box in each place and say, okay, we have a control, a safeguard in there of some kind, so we think we're okay, but we haven't tested it and we haven't really assessed it in detail. We're just doing a check the box risk assessment. I don't like those because the odds are very good that you didn't create a big enough knowledge base to, encompass all the black swans that might be lurking within your perimeter. You want to find them if you can. You won't find them all, but you want to find as many as you can. So you do something where it costs somewhat more, but you find out more about the vulnerabilities, the threats that you do face, so that you can actually do something. And then you need to be ready to respond because the bad thing will happen. I sort of work from an information security pyramid, which is kind of a nice graphic that actually was developed by Jody Westby, who's a very smart cybersecurity lawyer I've known for many years, worked with quite a bit. She's more of an in the beltway kind of person than I am, but she's really savvy. And she came up with kind of a pyramid as to how all this works. And I think I alluded to this a bit before. You start with boots on the ground and sort of work it up. And so, you can look at it and say, okay, well, we've got these different layers in the organization, operations, the cross-fertilizing team that puts all the information together, the C-suite that needs to understand and report to the board in a condensed, crisp way so that the board can accept what's going on, what the risks are, or not accept them and say, we authorize you to spend money. And spending money is always better if you have a need for it. And then so that flows, the information flows up each step of the pyramid, and then the decisions and authorization flow down. From the top, the folks at the top tell the C-suite, okay, here's an acceptable level of risk, and here's your budget, your global budget. And the folks in the C-suite then turn around to operations and say, okay, here's what we could spend it wisely, and here's, the extent to which you have the ability to accept risk, or maybe here's what you need to report back to us about risk. And then the cross-organizational folks are actually the policy development folks. They develop them and recommend them to the C-suite, but they develop them in the context of reality for the folks who are the boots on the ground. Because there are a few things I hate more than policies and procedures that don't actually match what you do, because then people won't do them and you're automatically out of compliance with your own policies and procedures. So, set it up in that kind of a process, whatever works for your organization. Do the best you can to get that in place. Have your reporting up and policy review and revision coming down, and then lather, rinse, and repeat as needed.
What I'm hearing, John, this is a far cry from the old days when we worried about Sarbanes-Oxley and compliance with a single law. Then we saw subsequent laws being piled on and overlapping and conflicting. What you're describing is an evolution, where today we're looking at this entire ecosystem, and you're developing a process that's recursive, that responds to change in technology, change in laws. Is that correct? I think so. I mean, I went through a process, as you recall, because you were there with me, where I tried, and a lot of people were trying to figure out, okay, we have all these different laws that might apply to one organization. How can we reconcile them? And we created gigantic spreadsheets and tried to figure out, okay, so what do they have in common and what don't they have in common? And that just became clearly unworkable. And that was, for me, that happened, I suppose, started happening 10, 12 years ago. And that was when I just said, I do need to know what the laws are. I do need to track their requirements, but I will drive myself and my clients crazy if I say, I've got this spreadsheet with all of these things in it, and we're checking all these boxes here, and we're spending all our time checking boxes, and we're not actually solving problems. And the fact is that if you check all the boxes, you're still out of compliance anyway. So
the exercise obviously was not going to be the most useful. So as I say, as a lawyer, of course, I need to know what the laws are that apply to my clients, and I still do have those darn spreadsheets because sometimes you just need to fill out the checklist. Do the gap analysis and understand what you do and don't have, because sometimes for some laws, HIPAA, you need to have a written document in all of these areas. So you check the box with your written document. But if all you do is check the box, you probably haven't addressed your actual risks.
You're reflecting what I hear from employers, that they want to hire people who can think and solve problems, not checklist people. And so what you're affirming is that the practice has moved, the legal practice and the compliance practice has moved to this more organic problem-solving environment, in your opinion.
I think that's best practice at this point. Yes, I think the other one, I still run into people who do that or think that that's what you do.
So do I.
Yeah, we will. And that, suits some people, but I don't think it suits organizations very well. And I certainly don't think it's appropriate for addressing the threat environment. And the threat environment is what matters, because,
unfortunately, they're driving the ship.
Well, I'm afraid so. If we aren't, I wish we could get ahead of them. I don't think we will.
So what do you do, John, when you're out of compliance with a particular law? As you said, you have conflicting legal requirements, different compliance regimes. You're managing your system as a complete system. What happens if there's a conflict, or you're audited, or you're found to be out of compliance with this little thing?
Well, as I say,
How do you handle it?
I pretty much guarantee that any organization of significant size, even a highly competent one, I guarantee it can be found out of compliance with something. Part of it is some violations are technical fouls and not as important as actually addressing the risks.